in your hymnal 415. To Christ be true. To Christ be loyal and be true, his banner be unfurled, and borne aloft till it secure the conquest of the world. To Christ the Lord be true, for he will ever go with you and help you all your conflicts. To Christ the Lord be true. To Christ be loyal and be true, and noble service prove. Your faith and your fidelity, the fervor of your love. To Christ the Lord be true. For he will ever go with you and help you all your conflicts through. To Christ the Lord be true. To Christ be loyal and be true, and he will be your friend, defending and protecting you till life's triumphant end. To Christ the Lord be true, for he will ever go with you and help you all your conflicts through. To Christ the Lord be true. Now dismiss to our classes.
Good morning. All right. Let's turn to Joshua chapters 10 through 12. Joshua chapters 10 through 12. I don't know if we'll get through all that. You are smiling at me. But it's been a few weeks, so I'll try to give a quick review, and then we'll get into the end of Joshua chapter 10. I will tell you that the theme of Joshua 10 through 12 probably will not be hard for you to remember, I think. If we just took the most basic theme. Anybody have an idea what Joshua chapters 10 through 12? And don't go deep on me. Just tell me, what do you get out of Joshua 10 through 12? What did you say, Roger?
All the other kingdoms.
Yeah. Joshua and Israel kill a bunch of kings. Okay, this is the theme. All right. Now, there are some deeper, you might say more refined things we learn about God as we're moving through Joshua. And we'll talk about that at the end of the study, Lord willing, this morning. But, and just hang on to that. So you have to be patient moving through to say, okay, I get this. This seems like a historical record. And it is. But there's more down there underneath regarding who God is. And many of these things we've talked about, but we want to reiterate those things. And there may be a few things that we haven't touched on that we'll try to emphasize today. So we actually dealt with the beginning section of Joshua 10. I had to go back and look at where we left off, so I'm pretty sure this is it. That got us to, we were just about to get into verses 29 through 43. We had looked at some key verses. These 5 kings, remember, they attacked Gibeon we'll review a little bit about Gibeon, and of course there's an alliance, a strong alliance there between Israel and Gibeon, as unexpected as that might have been. And so to attack Gibeon is to attack Israel at this point, and to attack Israel is to attack who? God, okay? So let me just mention a few things. We get some details about the southern and northern campaigns of Israel's conquest of Canaan. These chapters, again, are displaying great attributes of God. God's faithfulness, God's power, God's judgment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Those principles are also emphasized in the New Testament. So a lot of the times when you read what we're reading right now, and you study Joshua, for instance, chapters 10 through 12, there might be the temptation to say, oh, this feels so different than the God of the New Testament. It is important to see that there are some themes being emphasized for Israel and for us to see the faithfulness of God. But the idea of God bringing judgment on his enemies and God bringing judgment on the wicked and the severity of God's judgment to those who are antagonistic to him and hostile to him, that's not just an Old Testament theme. In fact, there are many sections in the New Testament that take that and develop it. The idea of God's mercy and God's grace that we read so much about through Jesus in the New Testament. We can find sections, even when we went through Numbers, where the Old Testament emphasizes that as well. Now, if you start talking about dominant themes, that may be a little different. But don't think that God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament, or the God of the New Testament is different than the God of the Old Testament. He's the same God. So, if you look at it from a larger kind of framework, Joshua 1 through 5, we read about preparation for the conquest. In Joshua 6, which is really important, what happened in Joshua 6? Who was defeated in Joshua 6? Well, Joshua 6 and 7. Jericho. Yeah, Jericho, and then we get into Ai. He'll tend to come back to Jericho just because that's the first major victory, okay? And it's an important victory. So you have Jericho in Joshua 7 and 8. You have Ai and Achan, very important event there. We spent a good bit of time there. By the way, those principles come back in the New Testament. In Joshua 9, we have this treaty with Gibeon. And how did Gibeon get that treaty one more time? Yeah, it was through deception. And there we really see, to be honest with you, you see the grace and the mercy of God toward Gibeon because God is true to himself. It's not that Gibeon was such high, integrity and character. It was the very opposite. But you see God's faithfulness that says, yeah, it was through deception and through Joshua, but we're going to be faithful to this. What did some of the Israelites want Israel to do with the Gibeonites? Yeah, but there was the word of God's promise was very important. Go ahead.
The leaders of Gibeon humbled themselves.
That's right.
To Israel, to God and Israel.
Right. So it was deception, but it wasn't couched in a framework of, just trying to rebel against God. There does seem to be, and when they have some consequences come to them, you're right, they humbly submit to that. And so there is something there to learn. So Joshua chapters 10 and 11 is Israel, some of their largest military campaigns. Let me mention a few themes to you about those campaigns. So when you're reading through Joshua, I think really if you read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but especially Joshua, sometimes you almost feel overwhelmed by what feels like violence. I mean, warfare, okay? But there's some deeper themes I want you to be thinking about as we move through. Number one, and we've emphasized this, but this is important for us today, God fights for his people. So when we're in covenant with God and we're in fellowship with God, God defends or fights for his people. And if you look at chapter 10 and verse 14, the text there says, "There was no day like that before or after it when the Lord listened to the voice of a man For the Lord fought for Israel. And we're spiritual Israel. We're God's people today. And so you know when you're walking with the Lord that he cares about you. Verse 42, so, you know, you're in this chapter telling you about, but there's these theme statements. Verse 42, Joshua captured all these kings in their lands at one time because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So I would say to you, when you're reading through Joshua, even in these kind of dense sections, and you're going to get, if we get far enough, you're going to get some long sections of their victories and that kind of thing. Rather than going, okay, how does that apply to me? Look for, when you do your reading, look for those theme statements. And they're usually very simple statements. So it's not that they're hard to understand. But when you're in a historical record, at least this has helped me, when I'm reading and it starts getting dense in Joshua, just hang in there. And when you see those statements like those two that we just read, that God fought for Israel, God was fighting for Israel, then I know that's like a framework he's putting this history in. So it's not just, you know, dense history for that sake. He's giving us the history, but the theme and the context really applies to us today. We're not part of physical Israel. We're part of spiritual Israel, and there's a bigger spiritual theme about God overcoming his enemies and our spiritual enemies as well. What are you going to say?
God fought for his people. You know, Jericho was very miraculous, wall and all that. In Joshua 24, it talks about the hornet that he sent before them. If you ever encounter hornets or yellow jackets or anything like that, they would destroy a modern army practically. I mean, it's just, it is
Overwhelming.
And I'm sure that God did it. He was as well.
Right.
But that's, he did it in many different ways.
That's right. And we're going to come back to that. That's a really valuable point. Anybody else? Right, go ahead.
On that the Israelites didn't have horses and chariots as well.
That's right.
You know, some of these nations we're going to see in the north, I mean, they're very formidable opponents, and I think that was purposeful that God wanted to show you the ultimate
That's right.
defeat from a lesser opponent. So.
And we'll get into that more, but Rob's right, because there's a section where he talks about some of these militaries being like the sand of the earth. I mean, just imagine that. I mean, when they came out with all their horses and chariots and all that. And he's going to tell them, yeah, they have all these horses. We're going to take care of that too. But that's right, because we're going to get into some battles where clearly Israel, from a military standpoint, and they had a great military at this point, but it was going to be quite inferior to what they were facing, and yet they were going to be victorious, which I do think is part of God's purpose in showing. It's a whole different situation when you're following truth and you're following the true God and you're walking with him with his power. And we're going to see some different ways, like Alan mentioned, where you see God as a warrior. And that's a theme we see, the warrior God. By the way, can you think of a book in the New Testament that's going to talk about Christ as our warrior king? Yep, the book of Revelation. Well, the book of Revelation about Jesus, he's riding a horse, he's got a two-edged sword. All of that language, if you're familiar with Ezekiel, Daniel, but even if you're familiar with Joshua, and that's interesting because if you look at even the names Joshua, and you think of how we pronounce Jesus, you're talking about the Lord as our salvation. So there's, and we got into this in Numbers, but there is such beautiful connection and continuity in the flow of the biblical story when you start like cutting it up. And I understand there's a difference in being under the old and the new, but from a Bible student standpoint, if you cut it up and you just say, I'm just going to look at Joshua and I don't see how that foreshadows the New Testament, or I read the New Testament and I don't see the richness of what's going on, I really miss out on the fullness. When you see this story in its fullness, and I think that's why Paul talks about the mystery being revealed about Jews and Gentiles and this narrative or story of salvation. So we see God fighting for his people. We're going to see judgment on wicked nations in chapters 10 and 11. We see the fulfillment of divine promises come to chapter 11 and verse 23. The scripture there says, so Joshua took the whole land according to all the Lord had spoken. And notice this, not just what the Lord had spoken to Joshua. What does he say? To who? Moses. That reminds you, this is that promise he had made to Moses, and we could argue that promise goes all the way back to who? Abraham. Yeah. So you think of big names in the Old Testament. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you think of Moses, and you think of Joshua actually doing this. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to the divisions of their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. So peace is coming. There's another thing, that peace comes after the battle. All right? Leadership and obedience is seen in chapters 10 and 11, and we're going to see, we've already seen the power of prayer. Joshua in chapter 10, what does he do as Gibeon is being attacked that seems different than some previous instances? Which is, we talk quite a bit about this, but what did Joshua do with God? Yeah, he relied on God. He prayed to God about what to do, and we saw God's manifestation of that. So when we studied Joshua 10, 1 through 5, you had the 5 kings that attacked Gibeon. They were trying to have an alliance because they realized what had been going on with Israel. Israel responded. God intervened. Gibeon pled, come quickly, save us. Israel was true to their promise, and we talked about how that happened. We had the whole issue of the long day that Alan mentioned, the sun standing still. So Joshua prays this bold prayer, and this wonderful thing happens by God's power. Then we hit Joshua 10, 15 through 27. The 5 kings were executed. We talked about that. This symbolizes divine authority and power. Now that gets us to Joshua 10 and verses 28 through 43. And now we're looking at the southern cities. Okay. Notice some key points here. And he mentions these southern cities. Your favorite thing to read in the morning, I know, is to talk about, Makkedah and Libnah and Lachish and Gezer and Eglon and Hebron. That's a familiar city for you, Debir. But there's some key points I want to focus on. So let's look at chapter 10. So we have these victories, but I want to look at verse 40 of chapter 10. And let's read that. So they're having this conquest of basically southern Palestine. Let's read, and I know I read a little bit of verse 42, but I'd like to read verses 40 through 43. Verses 40 through 43. Who would like to? Mike Binko, if you would.
Joshua conquered all the land, the mountain country and the south, and the lowland, and the wilderness slopes, and all their kings he left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel had commanded. And Joshua conquered them from Kadesh, Barnea, as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon. All these kings and their land Joshua took at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal.
Very good. Okay, now we could read that whole section, but basically that section is summarizing what you see when it says that nothing that was breathing was left. So there's no minimizing what actually is occurring. I would mention to you a couple of things. I know we've talked about it, but when we're going through this section, I think it's important to remember. Verse 40 says, again, Joshua struck all the land, the hill country and the Negev and the lowland and the slopes. So you see the movement that's going on. And all their kings. He left no survivor, But he utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Now, there's a couple of things to think about. Number one, before we get into what some people challenge about this, and that is, how much of God's commandment is Joshua following? All of it. All of it. There seem to be some that think you can't really follow all of God's commandments, but we don't get that anywhere in the Old or New Testament. Now, we all fail from time to time, but that's on us. That passage shows you at this juncture, Joshua and Israel are following all that the Lord had commanded. So let's think about it from this standpoint. There are those who, they just don't care. Like, there's not anything God says that they care about, okay? So we might describe them, they're just completely rebellious to God. Okay? You have those situations. How does God feel, generally speaking, about partial obedience? How would he characterize partial obedience? Yeah, it's disobedience. So probably a great example of somebody who tried that was King Saul. And God described him as being stubborn and rebellious and disobedient. So when you think about being faithful, the idea of faithfulness, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm flawless, but it means my heart is such, I want to follow God completely, fully. So a heart that's full of faithfulness is going to strive to be fully obedient. So when you have Israel and you have Joshua, and that text emphasizes this because it's contrasting with later on, but if you'll notice it, when it says Joshua did this, it emphasizes, and notice the language, just at the end of verse 40, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. The other example I can probably think of, you remember the young prophet that goes out and he comes back, and what did God tell him? Do you remember the commandment he gave him when he came home?
Back home and not stop.
Yeah. Do you remember what the old prophet basically said? Don't worry about that. God, and he even said, God told me something different. And so he listened to what he's depending on this man, even though God had been very clear with this young prophet. And of course, we know what happens on his way home. Why? Because that's what partial obedience gets somebody. Okay, so I do think it's important to know, like, if I know what God has said and I love the Lord, my heart needs to be that I'm fully going to give myself to him. And there can be a process of learning that, but that's where I have to get. Go ahead, Al.
Yeah, another one we use is lukewarm.
Oh, yeah.
Partial, neither hot nor cold.
Yeah, and we know how the Lord felt about that. Yeah, he wanted to spew that person out of his mouth, or that attitude out of his mouth. Okay, so let's, somebody says, boy, this is rough, and it is, Joshua chapter 11 and other sections. And we've talked quite a bit about this, but some say, well, this, Bruce, looks like ethnic cleansing. I mean, especially skeptics and others who don't have a high view of Scripture and that kind of thing. So it's not ethnic cleansing. It is judgment on people who had for a long time been wicked. And if you just pick up Joshua like 11, you pick up Joshua 10, 11, and 12, and you just read it and you pull it completely out of its context, you might feel like that this is just one of those situations where it almost feels like out of the blue, but again, you're missing the story. And skeptics tend to miss the story too. They'll go to this section, but they don't go back to Genesis chapter 15, I think verse 16, where you find out God had been patient with the Canaanites for a long time. And I know we've mentioned this, I just think it's important to recognize he had been patient with them for a long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they had ambushed his people. Again, they were involved in infanticide. There was all kinds of difficult things. Now, from a skeptic's standpoint, if you gave that framework, it does change how you perceive the narrative. So they don't do that because they're trying to undermine and undercut who God is. But this is, yes, is it ethnic cleansing? No. And we've already seen examples where those from other people groups have come into Israel and been taken care of by Israel. This reflects divine judgment. The Canaanites, as I said, had been wicked for a long time, but eventually God brings judgment. The other thing we're going to see in this section, and do see in this section, is that God keeps his promises. Now, there can be conditions attached to those promises. If you do this, then you'll receive that. If you don't do that, then you'll receive this. But he is going to be faithful to his promise, okay? So when we get to chapter 11, that gets us down through really this conquest. These are very similar, so I wanted us to look more at the themes. In Joshua chapter 11 now, we're going to see northern Palestine overcome. So let's read Joshua chapter 11. And Kelton, if you would, go ahead and read, I tell you what, go ahead and read verses 1 through 9. I think that'll be it. Yeah, that's a good section to stop. Yeah, go ahead.
What's your opinion on why Jerusalem is not mentioned in the southern?
Boy, I don't know. Do you have an idea?
I really don't. I was just curious.
Yeah. Let me look at that, Rob. That's a good question. Yeah.
Some people say, they were either too formidable or was it something they waited until later that the tribes handled, the individual tribes handled on their own.
Yeah. I wouldn't think they, at this point, I mean, if God's throwing hailstones, I don't, in some places, I don't know that it's that. There may be some other strategic reason or spiritual. That's a good question. Let me look. I'll look at that. That's a good question. So the question is why Jerusalem isn't mentioned. Oh, I don't know.
The next day they did.
No, it took a period of time. Yeah. Go ahead.
They're the Jebusites, correct?
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, they're not conquered until David
That's right.
takes it.
Yeah.
That's years.
Yeah. I'll try to go back and look at that. Those are good questions about Jerusalem. Go ahead. Ronnie's going for number 3. Y'all got me this morning.
I got a note that says it lasted about 7 years, 1405 to 1398.
That makes sense. I would have thought it took a number of years there. This wouldn't have been it's not a 6-month conquest. Yeah, right. But right now it seems like absolute victory. Just can you imagine? I mean, just them moving through these great militaries and power, and no matter what they do, Israel's just running through it. Anybody else? Those are all good questions. So I need to remember, Rachel, help me remember. You writing it down for me? You typing it down? So Jerusalem's not being mentioned. Was there another question? Well, we kind of answered it took a while. And how long was it before they actually conquered him? And people probably already know because they've looked it up on their phone. But I will look into it this week. Anybody else?
Yeah.
I don't know. So chapter 10 and verse 23, let's look at that. Yeah, it says they did so and brought these 5 kings out to him from the cave. The king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron. That's right, Julie. You're right. Anybody have thoughts?
Well, to the next chapter.
We're in chapter 12. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. The king of Jerusalem, so perhaps there's implications there. Well, I'll look at it, and I'll come back and say y'all were right. But I will look at it. But that is interesting. I'm glad y'all pointed that out, that the king of Jerusalem was killed. Yeah.
Maybe that they didn't necessarily occupy all these places densely or even at all. It's when they re-inhabited by people later on. That might be what we heard.
Did y'all hear what Alan said? So, like and you tell me if I'm not getting this right, but even if let's say the king of Jerusalem was killed, but that doesn't necessarily mean they immediately inhabited. They may have come back later and inhabited that section, which does help with that question. Yeah.
Those cities would have been desolate.
Yeah.
And there was a mention about God saying, hey, I don't want all these cities to be desolate because the animals would come
Right.
out wild.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'll go back and look at it. Jesse, did you have a question? Or
Going slow, because they thought that they could if they went too fast, they couldn't keep the land. It was some kind of, I can't remember the verses, but there was an idea that they were going to go slow as they went through.
methodically, yeah,
And we could keep that land once they got that land.
yeah.
And while the wild beasts and nothing takes over either. I guess there was some idea. I wish I knew that verse was. I don't know where it's at right now.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have all the verses by next Sunday. I promise. If they're in there, we'll have them. Go ahead.
I'm gonna jump ahead. When you get to Judges, it talks about them not completing the
That's
conquest. And you remember Othniel, I mean, he took, was Anak, I can't remember if it was that or
That's
whatever.
okay. Go ahead.
But anyway, they were in their land that they inherited, but they were not driven out. And Othniel said, Lord's been with me. I'm going to go do this. And he doesn't. So all the land is not conquered, or everybody is not completely destroyed.
Yes, I would say that even if you get what land they got, remember the maintaining of that was conditioned on them continuing to walk with the Lord. So they could lose what they had, which they did, that's all. So, yeah, we will definitely. So we've got our questions. I'm going to be busy all week on Joshua. No, I'll look at Jerusalem and get some more solid details on that. And did we have anything else, Rachel? Nobody, no other great questions? Hang on, Jessica. But I do have, my feeling has been from reading it, from the material I've read, that it seems to me they were methodically working through the land. I mean, they were wonderful victories that they methodically were. I would think that if you're going to occupy land. Jessica, what were you going to say?
As far as Jerusalem goes, it was by far the most military fortified city that they would come across ever. And there was an extreme respect for Jerusalem because it's the home of Melchizedek.
Right.
And we can see that with Adonizedek later on. But it was they understood the importance of Israel. And it's on a hill, way more than any of the other places.
So perhaps strategically, you think?
Very strategically set there by
That would make
Melchizedek
sense.
and very unwilling to go down.
Yeah. So if that's the case, it would make sense they're methodical as they're moving through, and that might be one that we get later on. Okay. All right. Okay, so going back to, let's see, Kelton, you never read, did you? Chapter 11. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 9.
1 through 9. Then it came about when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of it, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshaph, and to the kings who were of the north in the hill country, and in the Arabah, south of Chinneroth, in the lowland, and the heights of Dor on the west, to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite in the hill country, and the Hivite at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mizpah. They came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So all of these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Meron, to fight against Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Meron and attacked them. The Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Mizrachoth-maim and the valley of Mizpah to the east. And they struck them until no survivor was left of them. Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire.
Okay, thank you. So we have Jabin, king of Hazor, and he forms this massive coalition. In fact, the section there, this is what I was referring to earlier. says that they were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So try to kind of put yourself in Israel's position. So you look, and these people it's just massive military here. And the text emphasizes that he's going to do what the Lord commanded. Now, in times past, let's go all the way back into our study of Numbers in Israel's past history. If Israel had seen that, and if unbelief or distrust in any way had set in, what might they have done? Yeah, we're not doing this. That is not what happens here. So they're trusting God. So you do see kind of in the story as a people, at least for right now, we've seen a lot of growth. I mean, even if you go back to Jericho, and then we had the problem with Ai, but then they end up overcoming that and learn from that, and they keep progressing here. Hazor was one of the larger Canaanite cities. So itself was strategic, it was powerful. And one of the things we see when you thought of massive from a standpoint, if you look at this idea of the multitude of the soldiers here, and why horses and chariots? What would horses and chariots represent to them? Yeah, like tanks. So if I was trying to think of if you think of the idea of military technology, okay? For them, we would think of very high-tech stuff. So if you have horses and chariots, why would that be difficult for Israel to deal with? What'd you say, Daryl?
They didn't have any.
They didn't have any, okay? So you're dealing with a people that from the standpoint of this time are way superior to you. They have what you don't have. I mean, it would be like us going into battle with a country or a nation. We just don't have the technology they have, okay? So when you look at the horses and chariots, and yet Israel seems constant, why do they seem so faithful? What is it about them that's causing them to be faithful?
They've seen what God did for them in the past.
That's right. So there's trust. There's trust in the Lord. So when you look at horses and chariots and that kind of thing and the military strength of this, and yet, and this is a major faith lesson for us, the point is not the physical power they're facing. The point is, who are they serving? And so if they're serving God, they don't have to have the difficulty that they might have if they were not, okay? So then we look at verses 6 through 9. So God calls them to face battles when they are outmatched. Why would God have done that? What's his purpose in asking them to face people that physically outmatched them? I mean, he did it.
Depending on him.
Right. So they would recognize it's not of their own power. It's not of their own strength. It's by his grace. It's by his power. So when we get to verses 6 through 9, what does God tell Joshua or encourage Joshua? Don't be afraid, which implies he could have been. Now, this takes us back when Joshua first became, the real leader here. What did God tell him? Don't be afraid. Be courageous. I'll be with you. Don't turn to the right. Don't turn to the left. Okay. So we see this again. So God says, don't be afraid. He says, tomorrow I will what? I will deliver them. Now, he mentions hamstringing the horses and burning the chariots and all that kind of thing. There's a couple of things I wanted to ask you about that. So does anybody, I'm sure some of you guys do, are more familiar with horses. What did they do to hamstring the horses? What was that? Say that again, Ron.
Cut a leg or their legs so they could not roll.
Right. So the horses, if they can't run, this puts Israel in a different position. So there was a method for them to be able to deal with these people. So they did that. And then what else did they do with their chariots? They burned them. Well, that changes everything. I mean, it changes a lot. So he says, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to burn their chariots. You're going to hamstring their horses. So they do exactly what God had told them to do. So God removes any possible real obstacle here in the minds of the people. I mean, God could do what he wants to do, but he's taking away what appeared to be their military advantage in technology. He's taking that away from them. Alan, and then I'll come back to Tony.
He took it from them after they defeated them, but he also took it from Israel.
That's a good point.
That they wouldn't have those weapons of war at their disposal.
Yeah. So, I mean, God could have done it anyway, but he removes that psychologically from their mind. That's a good point. Tony?
He does make it where they can win the war, but it's dependent upon them to do their part.
That's right.
And think about it, they've got to catch the horses, they've got to handle the horses, they've got to burn the chariot. There is work that they have to do, no different than us today.
That's a great point.
So he's giving it to them, and they're not earning it per se, but they have to fulfill their obligation in order to be successful.
That's right. And that goes back to that theme we've been talking about all the way through Joshua. God's power, God's grace, our participation with God. And God wants that. So that's a good point. Yeah, go ahead.
Spoke, I said, I'm in Caleb.
Oh, yeah.
I'm
Okay.
sorry about that.
No, you're okay. Yeah, I would never misspeak, of course. Everybody knows I do it regularly, so so don't worry about that. All right, let's see. So Hazor's destroyed in Joshua 11:10 through 15. Joshua destroys them completely. And Hazor was the head of several of these kingdoms. The destruction is total because Hazor was the center of this Canaanite idolatry. Verse 15 emphasizes, and this goes back to what Tony and others have said, Joshua left nothing undone of what the Lord commanded through Moses. We talked about complete obedience. I'm moving here because I want to get through chapter 11 and hit some themes here. Chapter 11 in verses 16 through 23, you get a summary of the conquest. And now I have in my notes that there was a long war that followed. So you're talking about at least 5 to 7 years. So this is not a quick campaign here. But they remained faithful. We read about the Anakim, those giants, they're defeated, except those who fled to Philistine territory. And he says the land has rest. And so after great battles, God always gives his people rest. So before I kind of get into some themes that I want us to take with us from these chapters so we can hit chapter 12 next week, Lord willing. Jesse, go ahead.
That verse I was looking for.
Okay.
Deuteronomy 7:22 says, "And the Lord thy God will put out those nations before thee by little and little. Thou mayest not consume them at once, lest the beasts of the field increase upon thee."
That's right. That's it. Okay, so what should we learn from chapters 10 and 11? And I touched on some of these, but let's go ahead and hit them again. Number one, as we mentioned, God fights for his people. God defends his people. You get that repeated refrain, the Lord fought for Israel. And we get, Alan mentioned this, but the victories are supernatural in many ways. You have hailstones, you have the long day, you have the panic, the psychological warfare that comes upon other people. The other thing is, and I mentioned this, when you think about the judgment of God, that's a theme we need to learn about. Judgment is real and it's just, but it wasn't without warning. The Canaanites had been involved in their activities with innocent victims. After 400 years of warning, God brought judgment. Sometimes we think if a long time passes, God forgets about it, but he does not do so. The other thing is, God honors his word. We've already learned that with the Gibeonites, but he is true to his word. He kept his covenant with Gibeon. God blessed them for it. Integrity and humility really matter to God. And even when we make some pretty serious mistakes, if we will repent and be humble before God, there can be blessings for us. And then finally, God's promises never fail. And again, we see that in chapter 11. and verse 23, which we read. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from wars. Now here's what I would like for you to think about and maybe do. So you hit chapter 12. Look at chapter 12 for a minute and look at about verse 9 through 24. Does that look fun? Okay, so here's what I want you to do. Don't worry about getting all the pronunciation right. Why is that there? Okay, I want you to think underneath it. Why would in Joshua this have been recorded? And maybe there's 2 or 3 like big spiritual reasons why this was important for Israel to have and for us to have. So rather than just going, oh, I'm just skipping to the next section, why is it there? And that's what